A very good evening and warm welcome to this online dialogue, Soy Sauce Across Asia, Tradition, Taste and Technology. This is an event organized by the National Heritage Board as part of the 2021 Singapore Heritage Fest and co-organized by the School of Humanities at Nanyang Technological University and the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. There will be 5 speakers this evening, 4 historians and 1 practicing soy sauce maker, who will each speak about soy sauce production and consumption in different parts of East Asia. I have one of these speakers here with me in the studio today, while the others 4 will be addressing you remotely. Soy sauce is an ancient product having been produced in China for thousands of years. It is deeply woven into the foodways of not only China, but also Japan, Korea and Southeast Asia. In the 20th century, soy sauce also became an industrialized product, mass-produced for mass consumer markets. These talks all explore, in various ways, this tension between tradition and modernity. We will now proceed with all the talks before holding a question and answer period at the end. Please do submit questions that you may have for any of the speakers in the comment section of this Facebook live stream at any time of the event, and I will raise them to the speakers during the Q&A period. Now, without further ado, let's begin. The first speaker we have this evening is Professor Angela Casey Leong. Professor Leong is the Director and Chair Professor of History at the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences and the Joseph Needham Philip Mao Professor of Chinese History, Science and Civilization at the Hong Kong University. Her research on soy sauce investigates how the memory of traditional techniques and industrialization technology from the mid-20th century has impacted soy sauce production in contemporary China and Taiwan. Tonight, she will be speaking about black bean soy sauce and heritage in Taiwan. The floor is yours, Professor Leong.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you about soy sauce. I think I will begin by a food historian, a Japanese pioneer food historian, Ishige Naomichi. His insightful observation that soy sauce delineates East Asia as a cultural sphere. East Asia, I think by East Asia he means China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on. And then he continues to say that while fish sauce delineates Southeast Asia as a cultural region. Singapore, I think, somehow is in the intersection of these 2 spheres. You may agree or disagree with his observation, but I think we can also interpret his statement in different ways. But I think it would be interesting and meaningful to interpret it, that the many soy sauce varieties that one can find in different parts of East Asia are variations on the same theme. And both the theme and the variations offer interesting clues for understanding East Asian culture and history. Well, today I just take the example of a modern Taiwanese soy sauce as an illustration of this observation. Taiwanese soy sauce can be considered as a variation of Chinese soy sauce originating from Fujian province. Indeed, one characteristic of this traditional soy sauce made in Fujian is that only soybeans are fermented without adding wheat or rice flour, making the product more salty than sweet, as there is no breaking down of carbohydrates into sugar. However, that tradition was interrupted in Taiwan during the Japanese colonial period between 1895 to 1945, when Japanese method of fermenting yellow soybeans with wheat flour and in wooden barrels instead of ceramic jars was imposed on Taiwanese society, and the production was tightly controlled by the colonial government. And today, if you talk to a soy sauce maker in Taiwan, he will tell you that the so-called authentic Taiwanese soy sauce is made from black beans, not yellow beans. The black bean is an indigenous crop in Taiwan, and then the sauce is made without the addition of grain flour, like the Fujian tradition. This memory of soy sauce tradition goes hand in hand with the Taiwanese government recent policy of recultivating black beans Can I have the first slide? Second slide. Yes. So this is a photo showing the recultivating of black beans in Taiwanese society after many years of disappearance from Taiwan. So this policy by the Taiwanese government is recent. It was implemented as a measure to secure food security and food safety. Slide 2, please. The next slide, please. Yes. So these are the Taiwanese black beans. So they are recultivated for food security and food safety because imported soybeans are not always wholesome, and also to preserve threatened biodiversity in Taiwan. While black bean recultivation, which is very costly, is a state-subsidized policy, soy sauce businesses are encouraged to contract black bean cultivation by farmers. Next slide, please. Here you can see on the left a heritage soy sauce product, and on the right it's a shelf on a museum on which you could see that the paper on below saying that the black beans cultivation was contracted by this soy sauce company to encourage Taiwanese peasants to recultivate black beans, which is an expensive policy. So the government encouraged these Taiwanese soy sauce companies to contribute to the recultivation of black beans to make heritage black bean soy sauce. And these traditional black bean sauces are now marketed as heritage fruit, flagging Taiwanese tradition and identity. And these products seem to be getting more popular in the Taiwanese market. So this example tells us something about the complexity behind the claim, the observation that soy sauce delineates East Asia as a cultural region, because different soy sauce made with different technologies and producing different tastes embody different memories of tradition and enforce local identities in Taiwan, in China, in Hong Kong, and so on. I think my colleagues will continue the story on the other regions. But then I think all East Asians would agree that we cannot have a good meal without soy sauce. Thank you.
Thank you for that really insightful presentation, Prof. Leong. Our second speaker is Izumi Nakayama. Dr. Nakayama is a research fellow at the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences. Her work is focused on the histories of the body, gender, technology, and technology in Japan. Tonight, she will be providing an introduction to soy sauce production in Japan. Dr. Nakayama?
Thank you, and thank you for having me tonight. Thank you to Helen for inviting us to speak on our collaborative research project on soy sauce, and thank you all to those of you who are listening in. Soy sauce, or shoyu, used to be quite pervasive in Japanese homes in the latter half of the 20th century. In 1972, it was estimated that every family consumed, on average, 22.2 liters of it annually. However, by 2018, 46 years later, a typical household consumes only about 5 liters per year, a huge decrease. So commentators have pointed to a variety of factors, such as nutritional and health concerns over the consumption of sodium, the shift away from a rice-based diet, and other accompanying Japanese cuisines, which relied heavily on soy sauce, and the fragmentation of nuclear families, to name a few. Yet at the same time, there's been a slow revival of artisanal soy sauce, which sell artisanal craftsmanship and heritage at a premium price to the global market. So the title of tonight's session is Tradition, Taste, and Technology. And out of the three terms here, taste is perhaps the most difficult to share to a diverse audience, not to mention the fact that we're doing this as a live stream. Because our sensory languages and understandings are based on personal experiences, which differ greatly by time, place, age, gender, social cultural context, and a myriad of other factors. So, for example, my notion of salty might not be salty at all or considered sour or bitter, depending on one's visceral, olfactory, and sensorial baseline experiences, even within the same temporal and cultural milieu. So tonight, let me focus on tradition and technology, specifically the containers of soy sauce, to weave together a brief overview of one of the ways these two terms played a large role in the heritage of soy sauce and to authenticate its current iteration. Next slide, please. So by the 18th century, the soy sauce market in Japan was extensive. As seen in the image here, a wide range of wooden barrels ranging from the large-scale vats in the back, where you can see artisans standing on planks using a long paddle to mix the content, to the smaller individual-sized containers toward the front, which were used to sell to households and smaller establishments in the food industry. Each aspect of the process was specialized, with workers who embody the knowledge, devising and creating specific tools and technologies to facilitate the production. So in Edo, or modern-day Tokyo, soy sauce as a key ingredient and condiment served as the foundation for foods we know today as tempura, kabayaki eel, and sushi. Next slide, please. At the same time, limited amounts of soy sauce were exported via the Dutch East Indies Company to other parts of the world, where there exist records of Japanese soy sauce consumption in parts of Southeast Asia and even in France and other parts of Western Europe. However, as sea travel took some time, the soy sauce was sealed in these porcelain containers and covered with wax, such as these, and it's quite difficult to imagine what it would have tasted like. Next slide, please. So by the late 19th century, Japanese soy sauce production entered a new era where they engaged in large-scale production with an eye to pursuing new markets, both domestically and abroad, especially towards those territories that became victims of Japan's military expansion. Here's an image from Noda Kikkoman soy sauce, where you can see the gradual transformation of the production. As you can see some of the wooden vats in the back still with the barrels, but you can also see the use of brick fireplaces in the upper right-hand image. It might be hidden actually by the Singapore Heritage Fest title, but behind it you can see brick fireplaces to provide heat for steaming the soybeans, as well as a variety of metal buckets and containers that were gradually introduced. Next slide, please. By the early decades of the 20th century, this technological transition can also be seen in the infrastructure supporting the soy sauce industry, where the wooden barrels, pushed on trolley carts by men, as you can see in the upper right-hand corner, later led to the creation of motorized trolleys and laying down of railroads by Kikkoman, as you can see on the left, as well as the use of a fleet of bicycles, tricycles, and other motorized vehicles to make deliveries to the customers, as you can see on the bottom right-hand corner. While not shown here, Japanese soy sauce also took a much more extensive industrialization process in all aspects of production, governed by scientific management and research. Next slide, please. So in the immediate aftermath of Japan's defeat in World War II and the ensuing American occupation, soy sauce, which took over a year to produce, was seen as a luxury that Japan could not afford in times of severe food shortage. And the American occupation GHQ initially determined that soy sauce industry will only receive a limited amount of available defatted soy meal supply, while the amino acid industry, such as those like Ajinomoto, would receive the huge brunt. In order to survive the supply shortage, a new method devised by Kikkoman called the New Style No. 2, or Shinshiki ni Goho, where they blended the process into half chemical, half fermented, speeding up the process to make soy sauce, which allowed them to convince the American occupation to give them the majority of the soy meal supply. So images like these here that you see, mechanized production on a large scale, represented the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. So what you can see on your right is the sorting of the soybeans in a massive scale. And also to the left, you can see these huge vats of soy sauce that are obviously industrially produced. Let's see, by the end of the 20th century, over 56% of the market share were dominated by 5 big companies that you'd probably recognize, Kikkoman, Yamasa, Higeta, etc. In 2018, there were over 1,100 soy sauce companies, as opposed to the 6,000 that existed in 1955, but around 20 companies controlled almost 75% of the domestic share. So we have huge companies basically controlling the majority, or large majority, of the Japanese domestic market. Next slide, please. But being a small-scale producer, in fact, is what gives their soy sauce the authentic seal and taste of tradition, small-scale production methods, and traditional technologies. So compared to the massive steel vats that you just saw, here we see the wooden barrels that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, talking about the 18th century. The gentleman on the right here is using a paddle to mix the content of the wooden barrels, and these barrels, he estimated, were at least 200 years old. If you look to the upper rim of these barrels, you can see some crusty sediments, which remain from years of production in these containers, which have only been washed out with water, if at all. So counter to modern notions of sanitation and hygiene, these bacteria in the wooden barrels are seen as providing inexplicable umami and authentic flavors of traditional soy sauce. So in this post-capitalist consumer society, these small-scale productions of artisanal soy sauce, sold at premium prices, and I'm sure you can get those in Singapore as well, hits at a sweet spot of a global trend and discussion. And these are some of the themes that Professor Leung raised, and I think will come up later on as well. But these are issues of food safety, sustainability, health and obesity, organic and slow food movement, and etc., which intersects with attitudes and cultural shifts toward anti-industrial, anti-mass-produced foods, but also coinciding with each nation state trying to carve out national identities and cultural characteristics via food, as seen in the desires for protecting rights with geographic indicators or GIs, to the name of Kobe beef or champagne, to take an example, but also the rush towards getting one's national cuisine on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage list. So these wooden barrels that I think my colleagues will also speak on are in many ways the key to soy sauce production and its technology in the past, but also remain one of the key elements of establishing authenticity of production and taste in the present and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for that really interesting presentation, Dr. Nakayama. Next up, we have John Wong, who's an Associate Professor of Hong Kong Studies at the Hong Kong University. Dr. Wong's research focuses on flows of people and goods in the Pearl River Delta region. Apart from soy sauce, his work has also examined dairy products and the airline industry in Hong Kong. This evening, he will speak about the origins of the Made in Hong Kong label of soy sauce and how the recent disruptions resulting from Sino-US conflicts have reinvigorated interest in this label and resonated with a wave of local consumerism in Hong Kong. Dr. Wong?
Thank you very much. So we're moving from Taiwan and Japan and now getting to our third destination, Hong Kong. Izumi showed you some visuals on wooden barrels, and I have mine too. So can I have the first slide, please? What I will focus on here is a little bit different. Izumi talked about more the technology side of soy sauce production. Here, I would like you to focus on certain stenciled engravings here or prints on this wooden barrel. If we can click to the first visual, please. If you can advance one on the slide, please. There you go. So on the first panel on the right-hand side, you see this faint print, Made in Hong Kong. And that's precisely what I want to talk to you about today. Angela's focus on Taiwan is on the discovery or rejuvenation of soy sauce as heritage food in Taiwan. I'm not going to talk about traditional food. I am going to focus on the commercial side of things. And in the next few minutes, I would like to trace with you the origin of this Made in Hong Kong label to the US embargo on Chinese goods during the Korean War. And in particular, we'll focus on Gunzan, and the name of that you can see in the middle panel as well, which has traditionally targeted the US market, capitalizing on geopolitical exigencies over the years and grown in conjunction with the export-led Hong Kong economy. And we're fortunate today to have the speaker who would follow my presentation, Daniel Chan, who knows a lot about Gunzan because he's the fourth generation operator of that sauce manufacturer, who would continue the story into today's environment. So why am I interested in this? When we talk about Made in Hong Kong, we usually think about textile and the industrialization of Hong Kong. But then the cottage industry of soy sauce making actually face similar trade restrictions, but they've yet to receive our attention. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So what you see here is that soy sauce was but a small local market in Hong Kong before World War II. But the then British colony had served as a transshipment point for soybeans, soy sauce main ingredient, which were sourced primarily from Northeast China. And you can see here in the gray section imports, and then the solid line is the export. So the colony imported soybeans primarily from Northeast China and then shipped them to places like Macau and such destinations in Southeast Asia like Malaya to the Philippines and French Indochina. By comparison, what you see on the dotted line is that soy sauce production was only a budding industry in pre-World War II Hong Kong. Although a handful of soy sauce makers had set up operations in Hong Kong in the 1910s, the presence remained relatively insignificant. New entrants by the late 1920s, among them were the industry titan Amoy, which opened a factory in Hong Kong in 1929, and the budding producer Gunzan, which is the focus of my talk and also Daniel, established in 1928. Those entrants actually invigorated the industry quite a bit in the 1920s. What you see here is that following its gradual growth in the 1930s, soy sauce totaled but about $1 million Hong Kong dollars in 1940, so right before the Second World War. And of that total, the US accounted for 50%, the last year of British control before the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So Gunzan is the operator that we want to focus on, and where they set up shop is in Kowloon City, as you will see in this next slide. This is truly more of a cottage operation, and this place is of importance. We'll get back to that in a little bit. But this is the pre-war situation. And of course, World War II was a period of upheaval that upset a lot of the economic activities, not just in Hong Kong, but around the world. What truly transformed the soy sauce industry, though, was something that happened after the Second World War, is the Cold War, in particular, the PRC's entry into the Korean War, which prompted the US government to impose economic sanctions on the PRC. On December 16, 1950, US President Truman declared a national emergency and promulgated the Foreign Assets Control Regulations. The extension of that presidential decree, which was issued in August of 1951, effectively barred the import into the US of all products made with any Chinese raw material. Now, this whole issue of place of origin was becoming increasingly important in the post-World War II era. And the Hong Kong government had already tasked the Department of Commerce with the issuance of certificates of Hong Kong origin. But that was not quite enough for the US government during this period of heightened sensitivities. And after some prolonged discussions, the US and Hong Kong finally agreed on this special and complicated procedures of the issuance of comprehensive certificates of origin that attested to the place of origin for both the products and the raw materials. Why is that important for the soy sauce industry? Of particular benefit to the Hong Kong soy sauce industry was the extension of the list of items covered by the comprehensive certificate of origin regulations to include by March of 1954, hoisin sauce and soy sauce. Please go on to the next slide. The inclusion of soy sauce and hoisin sauce, which counts soybean as one of its major ingredients, allowed Hong Kong to capitalize on its role in the soybean trade. To earn the certification for exportation to the US, sauce makers bought the requisite amount of soybeans of non-mainland Chinese origin, paid the corresponding stamp duty according to weight, and off they go. And as you can see here, the US grew to become the top buyer of Hong Kong soy sauce in 1960, as the industry was gaining traction and registered consistent growth year after year. From 1960 to 1970, total volume doubled, and the US representation of that trade went from 32% to 42% in the decade that ended in 1970. Next slide, please. This is a page from Trade Journal. As you can see, sauce maker Gun Zhan played a critical role in the expansion of soy sauce exports from Hong Kong to the US. The company capitalized on the family's trans-Pacific connections and focused on the US market. So what we have here is some soy sauce makers leveraging the overseas connections and the trade regulations, allowing Hong Kong sauce makers to export to the US to redirect product flow. And soy sauce manufacturing at that time became a value-adding industry that strategically utilized the city's geopolitical position as a British colony connected to the mainland to develop business opportunities overseas. Now that brings us back to this notion of the place of origin. We say made in Hong Kong, but then you can go even deeper into that place. As we showed in the previous slide, the location of Gun Zhan in Kowloon City. Kowloon City at that time was not the densely populated urban area that it would later become, and offered Gun Zhan and other sauce makers ample land for the sunning or fermenting of soy sauce. Next slide, please. But as the trade expanded and real estate became more expensive for Hong Kong, Gun Zhan and other sauce makers had to vacate the old premises in Kowloon City to make way for the expanding footprint of Hong Kong's urban infrastructure. In particular, is the old Kai Tak Airport that got relocated or that expanded into the soy sauce manufacturing footprint. In Gun Zhan's case, they moved in 1967 to its current location in Yuen Long on the outskirts of Hong Kong, and you see here a picture from those early days. Next slide, please. And that move actually turned out to be quite fortuitous because it offered Gun Zhan and other sauce makers that moved out of Kowloon City the necessary footprint and production capacity to respond to the growth of the industry. From 1970 to 1980, soy sauce exports from Hong Kong expanded more than threefold. And in the following 10 years, you have another threefold increase in exports, basically, about 10% compound annual growth rate. Fueling this growth was the expansion of the US market, whose share of total Hong Kong soy sauce exports covered around 2/3 in the 1990s. Next slide, please. Daniel is going to continue to talk about Gun Zhan and its more recent development. What I would like to bring your attention to in this first half of the story is that rather than a sign of local pride in local products, the Made in Hong Kong label originated from the US embargo on mainland Chinese goods, as well as on products including ingredients from mainland China. So Made in Hong Kong conveyed a message that was politically imperative in the Cold War era and economically crucial to Hong Kong producers. The message that Made in Hong Kong products were not made in the PRC. Such an arrangement, manifested by the certification requirement and the Made in Hong Kong label, reflected the geopolitical situation of Hong Kong at that time and the political exigencies that affected the survival of a struggling yet budding economy, which included the soy sauce business. And I look forward to what Daniel has to say about recent development of the company and the industry. Thank you.
Thank you for your sharing, Dr. Wong. Our fourth speaker this evening is Mr. Daniel Chan. Now, Mr. Chan is a fourth-generation soy sauce maker and the current proprietor of Kun Chun Soy Sauce Factory in Hong Kong. Tonight, he will share with us some of the history of his own family company, as well as some of his own experiences as an artisanal soy sauce producer. Mr. Chan?
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. We can move to my slide and we can start my presentation. Yes. So here, as you can see from Dr. Wong's presentation, this is a barrel, one of our barrels that was sent from Hong Kong. It was made in Hong Kong. As a little bit history of this barrel first is this barrel is a wooden barrel. It's quite unique from my professor friends. They said this barrel is very different from Izumi's presentation, where you can see the barrels are all made of wood. But this one, you can clearly see there are iron metals with the casing on it. And this is also related to Hong Kong because back in the old days, Hong Kong is an important port for the navies, especially for the British navies to dock and have a maintenance. So this is a very unique barrel that represents Hong Kong, not only the materials, but also the overall economy as a British colony back then. And also, this is made outside from what I've heard from my elder employees. This barrel was made not inside our factory back then located in Kowloon City, but right next to it. So we share different soy sauce makers around the area share this barrel makers. And we got this barrel, we put our names on it, we print and made in Hong Kong. We filled this barrel with our soy sauce and we sealed it. And then we actually have this shipped over to the Hong Kong island and then into the shipping companies and then ship overseas to the United States. Actually, you can go back to the slide because there's more to it. And this barrel, I actually got it back from a few years ago from the United States at eBay, and it ended up in Maine, and in the state of Maine, which is like northeast of New York State. And in this barrel, I don't think that the picture shows it clearly, but it is this is another barrel. You can go back to the first slide first. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so this barrel is labeled on the other side of the barrel. It says its destination is New York. So this barrel is probably shipped before 1960s because when in 1967, we moved our facility to Yuen Long, which is no longer located in Kowloon City. But this barrel, it says in Kowloon, so it must be like somewhere before the 1960s. It can be in the 50s, it can be in the 40s. So that is the case of this barrel. So next slide. Yes. So I also discovered another slide which also had another barrel which is also still exists, and this ends up in a museum. It's a private museum in Seattle, and in the description you can see it says in this barrel is made in Hong Kong. It's by my family soy business, Kun Chun, but this one is in Yuen Long. So this barrel, it's more recent. It's probably in the 60s and 70s. I've known that in the 80s we stopped using these kind of barrels and we changed it to tin cans for the catering sector, for the restaurants, for hotels, for food factories in the United States. Okay, so this is a little bit history, continuing on what Professor Wong says, the historical development of our factory along with other soy sauce factories in this period as well. So our focus is on the Americas, including the United States, Canada, Mexico, all the way down to Peru, Argentina, Brazil, and even the Central American countries, for example, Panama, Costa Rica, Jamaica. These are all some of our destinations of where our soy sauce and our condiments go to from the very early on from the 30s and 40s. Okay, so next slide. So a little bit time jump. We discovered that very traditional advertisement. That advertisement is actually from the 1951, from a magazine in 1951. And last year when we discovered it, I revised it and add some more modern we update the address, we update, there's a QR code in there, there's a Facebook and Instagram in there, and then we put it in a newspaper as a retro, kind of advertisement. And this date, we specifically picked this date is last year's November 9th. That is the exact date when, in the recent history from last year, you guys in Singapore might not have the news, but in Hong Kong is a huge news, because that's when the United States from last year, they passed the regulation saying that all originally made in Hong Kong products can no longer be printed as made in Hong Kong. It needs to be stated that it is made in China. So as a business, we need to follow whatever regulations of our destination countries are. So this is unfortunately we need to update all our packaging, from the boxes to the tin cans to the bottles. Everything we need to update it. All the products that sent to USA needs to be updated to be made in China. So next slide. Here, we have huge news in Hong Kong, and even the Straits Times in Singapore, they report this news as well. It's a huge deal for us and also our friendly competitors in Hong Kong as well. So all our products, as you can see in this slide, we need to relabel it very quickly within 2 months of time notice. We need to relabel all our products from the carton box to all these tin cans. We need to cover up all the made in Hong Kong labels, and we need to stick a new label on there. You can see in the slide, some are in yellow to match our product name, and some needs to be just plain, print out from a printer, because we need to have these shipments go as soon as possible. So this is one of the huge deal, similar to what happens, 70 years ago in the Korean War, where we gained, an opportunity. This time, because of some policy changes in our destination countries, we need to relabel it as a made in China. And this policy, it's not going to go away, even though President Biden is now in office. But this policy of labeling all made in Hong Kong products as in made in China, it's not going to be going away anytime soon. So on the other hand, because of the COVID, everyone is affected, including us in Hong Kong. You can go to the next slide. Where we now have to have a focus on Hong Kong, because we cannot travel to to visit our customers in the United States, Canada, or Norway. So what I've done with my team and my company has done is, within the COVID from last year, we've tried to refocus our marketing work in Hong Kong. And as you can see in this slide on the right hand side, this is a very unique icon, a tram in Hong Kong. If you ever visit Hong Kong, if you're in Hong Kong Island, you will see this very old kind of transportation without air conditioning. It's as hot in Hong Kong in summer as in Singapore, and this type of public transportation still has no air conditioning, but it's a very unique icon from Hong Kong. And then we have advertisements on it. In Chinese, it says Kun Chun. It's still made in Hong Kong. So for guaranteed for our local customers in Hong Kong that my own brand is still in Hong Kong. We are not leaving anytime soon. We're still here producing, even though there are policy changes, even there are political or even economic struggles elsewhere. Here in our Hong Kong customer base, we're still guaranteed that our sauces are made in Hong Kong. And then on the upper left-hand picture, you can see an advertisement with a local 7-Eleven convenience store that we are having a crossover event with them. This started 2 days ago here in Hong Kong, and they use some of our products for some of the more convenient lunch boxes sold here in Hong Kong, and also with drinks as well. And then on our last, picture on the left and bottom corner, that's this is an advertisement that we have done this year, earlier this year around March and April. And this is an advertisement in a French colony in Africa. And the island is called Réunion, English Reunion Island, and it's right next to Mauritius. And this is one of our biggest market as well, outside of the Americas. So here I present to you some of the more recent development of our company and how we go, in different ways to adjust our position globally. With all these kind of unpredicted political, economical, and even health, as the COVID have hit us, has hit on all sides on the globe. So this is my presentation, and hopefully you can have better understanding of how Hong Kong local businesses do these kind of marketing strategies with in the recently. So I'll go back to the host.
Thank you, Mr. Chan, for that really interesting presentation. Finally, we have Helen Stevens. Helen is an Associate Professor of History at the Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. Helen is a historian of science and technology whose work focuses on the life sciences and information technology, as well as food history. In his talk this evening, he will give a brief overview of soy sauce in Singapore by outlining the different paths of two soy sauce companies that I'm sure many viewers will be familiar with, Yeo Hiap Sing and Kwong Wo Hing. Prof. Helen?
Thanks a lot, Galen, and thanks to all my colleagues and the speakers before me, and thanks to the National Heritage Board also for hosting this event. So my aim here is just to very briefly, in this quite short talk, to kind of outline very quickly a post-war history of soy sauce in Singapore. And actually, we can already go to the next slide, please. I'm going to do this through talking about two companies that Galen already mentioned, in fact. The company Yeo Hiap Sing, who produced Lighthouse soy sauce, and the company Kwong Wo Hing, and sort of taking these contrasting kind of examples of how the kind of story of soy sauce played out, I think can tell us something about the place of soy sauce within kind of modern Singapore. So next slide, please. I want to talk very briefly first about the kind of longer history of soy sauce in Singapore. In fact, soy sauce has a history dating back to the very earliest colonial times, if not even before that. There is a record in the early Strait settlements of soy sauce manufacturing, and these processes traveled with migrants from China to Singapore. There are also records from very early as the 1820s of the transshipment of Japanese soy sauce and soybeans through Singapore and to Singapore. And in fact, soy sauce in particular, most of it manufactured in Japan and then coming through Singapore, was in fact an important trade good into Europe, and it was used to then make other condiments such as Worcestershire sauce, for example, for the European market. And so Singapore already from very early colonial times played a pretty central role in that trade. But also some of the soybeans that came from places like Japan ended up staying here and either were basically made into soy sauce or also made into other products like tofu. So where was soy sauce actually made? So by the early 20th century, some of the soy sauce was made in what we might call a kind of factory, a kind of fairly low-level factory, but most of it would have been made at home or in kind of very small scale, like shop houses, small shops, and then either consumed at home or sold door to door. So that's in the slide. You see these itinerant kind of hawkers. These pictures are obviously from much later, from the 1970s and 80s, but you can see them. These people, this would be sold door to door off a trishaw or something like this. Next slide, please. So the first company that I want to talk about actually kind of was one of these more established kind of manufacturing businesses for soy sauce. So this was based on a story of migration from China. Liu Qianlian founded a soy sauce company in Zhangzhou in Fujian in 1901, but by 1937 Fujian was under siege. Zhangzhou was under siege by Japanese forces. And so he sent his eldest son to think about moving the business away from China. And so Liu Qianlian came to Singapore to relocate the business to Southeast Asia. And he wanted to relocate here. This was a good environment, not only because of linguistic and cultural ties to the Hokkien community, but also because Singapore has very good weather for soy sauce. A hot and humid climate makes it very good weather for soy sauce. And also ready supplies of salt and good infrastructure, transport infrastructure was also important. So Liu Qianlian's business was established as Yo Hiap Seng in 1938, excuse me, on Outram Road, just near Chinatown. And unlike many other soy sauce companies, they managed to survive the Japanese occupation. They were not taken over by the Japanese, and they managed to maintain their supplies of raw materials, so salt and sugar and soybeans, and also maintain some of their distribution networks even into the Malay Peninsula. After World War II, Yo's developed both its soy sauce manufacturing processes and they expanded their business into other domains. As the economy expanded after World War II, Qianlian sought to modernize the soy sauce business. In 1951, what you can see here on the slide is the establishment of a new factory or plant in Bukit Timah that fermented soybeans under machine-controlled conditions. They used thermostats, they used lab-like environments. So this is the kind of industrial style production that Izumi was talking about earlier. The factory also installed automatic filling and labeling machines, reducing costs and sort of ramping up production. Yo's, many of you would know it today, not just as a soy sauce company, right? They began also in the 1950s to expand and diversify their business into canning, into beverages, and they transformed the company into a growing international empire. By the 1960s, with the support of the Singapore government, who was keen to support this kind of industrialization, this would create jobs, right? It fits with Singapore's economic development. By that time, Yo's was exporting products to Brunei, to the Philippines, to the United Kingdom, to Australia, and also to the United States. In the 1970s, the business continued to grow. But the shifting economic priorities of the state also began to affect them as the sort of priority of the state shifted away from labor-intensive industries to more capital-intensive industries. And in fact, after the death of the Singapore founder, Liu Qianlian, in 1985, Yo's was riven by kind of family infighting, and eventually it was the family lost control of the business to a real estate magnate in 1994. So this kind of tells a story of how this particular company evolved from soy sauce to diversification to kind of almost to becoming a kind of real estate company in some sense. Next slide, please. The contrasting story I want to tell here is one of Kwong Wo Hing. Initially, Kwong Wo Hing followed a similar path. Wu Ho was an immigrant from Guangzhou who came to Singapore in 1940, but he did not come from a soy sauce making background. He learned how to make soy sauce here by working in other factories. He learned, he saved some money, and he opened his own factory in 1943 in Lavender Street, just near the old Kallang gas works. Kwong Wo Hing, unlike Yeo's, maintained their traditional soy sauce production methods throughout the 1950s, throughout the 1960s. But their business became increasingly pushed away from the city center. So in 1960, the Lavender factory actually had to relocate to a more industrial area in Lorong Tai Seng. And again, this was part of Singapore's efforts to modernize the economy and move away from these traditional industries, right? This was the time at which agriculture was also being pushed out. So although continuing as a very small-scale, family-run business, Kwong Wo Hing managed to endure. Simon Wu is now a third-generation practitioner and soy sauce maker. They did not close, or despite in the 1980s being relocated again to their current location, which is at Defu Industrial Park. And they continued to produce soy sauce in the traditional manner, using large earthenware vats exposed to the outside air and to the sun. The business attributes its success to the continuing loyalty of a small group of customers, but it has also benefited from the resurgence of interest in and attention to traditional foods. Again, this story is very similar to the one that Izumi was telling about Japan. The language used to describe Kwong Wo Hing is centered on notions of tradition, of heritage, and of artisanal production. My final slide, please. So, this very quick story of two soy sauces tells us a story about changing economic conditions and the changing value of different kinds of businesses in Singapore. An industrial produced soy sauce for an industrializing Singapore, and the revival now of an artisanal brand at a time when preservation and heritage are ever more important. So this tells us about the changing value of taste and food in Singapore. The success of Yeo's in the 1950s and 60s suggests that Singaporeans increasingly at that time valued hygienically packaged convenience food, cans food, packaged food, and that these foods were cheap and easy to prepare, but also considered efficient, healthy, and sophisticated. Now we have a kind of rediscovery of the importance of traditional foods, suggesting that for at least some Singaporeans, tastes have begun to change. What is valued about Kwong Wo Hing and its source is its old-time methods, its unique taste, and the value of preserving Singapore's national heritage. So what I find interesting about this story is that this is where two threads combine, the economic and the story of taste, the gustatory. These are linked together. The changing patterns of economic development are intertwined with changing ideas about what and how to eat. Ideas about what tastes good have a history that's connected to broader ideas about Singapore's economic development. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Helen, and a big thank you to all our speakers for their interesting and engaging presentations. We now have around 35 minutes for questions. Please type your questions into the comment section of this Facebook live stream and indicate which panelist your question is being directed to. Thank you for sending in your questions. Our first question is from Jenny Lee and is directed to Prof. Leong. So Prof. Leong, you mentioned that black beans was the original beans used in Taiwan, used by the Taiwanese from Fujian. So does that mean that Fujian used black beans to make soy sauce? And what is the difference between black beans and yellow beans?
Black beans actually is used. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Black beans are used for doing soy sauce mostly in southern part of China. This is a breed that grows best in the south. I have not found any concrete examples of soy sauce made from black beans in Fujian before 1949. But this was the memory of the Taiwanese that they used black beans to make soy sauce. But then the thing that that is interesting is that the Taiwanese used the Fujian, the northern Fujian practice of using simply the beans, the black beans, and without the flour, without the wheat flour. So there's something similar between the old Fujian method and the Taiwanese method, but the Taiwanese were very much focused on the recultivation of black beans. The difference between black beans and yellow beans actually is in the skin. If you open the skin, the inside is either yellow or white. There I cannot tell you the chemical content, the differences between the two beans, but I think black beans are smaller and more compact, and the kind of is not as maybe a little bit, after fermentation, the taste it gives is not as sweet as the yellow beans. But the Taiwanese would claim that soy sauce made from black beans are tastier in the sense that they find it more compatible with their cuisine, with their taste.
Thank you, Prof. Leong. The next question we have is from Ms. Christina Fong, and is directed to any one of our panelists. So Ms. Fong was recently blessed with a bottle of thick dark soy sauce and was told that the very top layer of the barrel is not sold but actually given away to beloved family and relatives because it is deemed as precious as gold. So if this is this true? Christina wants to know, and is there any more information that any of our panelists could provide on that?
Not something that I've heard before. Actually, most of us here, as a group, we've traveled together to various soy sauce production sites, and we've had the privilege of tasting even 30-year-old soy sauce. Yeah, I haven't heard that. I mean, I think there are many different kinds of practices around, who gets the various kinds of soy sauce. Maybe some of the my kind of fellow speakers here have some other insight into that, but I haven't heard that particular practice before.
Perhaps our other panelists who want to share their thoughts on this?
Yes, I do heard of when you are fermenting the soy sauce, and because for my company we only have the first extract, as other questions later on asked about tao tao in Mandarin with tou tou, or if it's translated literally, it would be the first extraction of the soy sauce, which really for our for a general understanding is a more premium soy sauce. This would be more of equivalent to like the top layer of the barrel, since I assume this question would be this barrel when they're fermenting, this is the first fermentation. They didn't put a second round of it, so this is the first round. So this should be a premium. I would say this is if for this Christina, this would be the premium soy sauce. And when you're saying the top layer of the barrel, I've heard some of my older employees saying that the depth of the bottle needs there's some requirement back in the old days when they're doing it in barrels. The first layer has because when you're fermenting soybeans, the residuals, and in the case of the Cantonese style soy sauce, we add wheat flour in it. So when the bean residuals and the flour residuals, they sink in, the top part would be more liquid. So I would assume this is more when you're pouring this batch of premium soy sauce out, it will have a more stronger taste, and it might have a more the texture would be more clear because they didn't mix it, so that the residuals didn't float up again. So it should be a premium soy sauce. That's from my understanding.
Thank you, Mr. Chan. So the next question we have is from Jeffrey Pakyam, and is directed to Prof. Helen. So, Prof. Helen, do you have any idea where Yo's got its technological expertise from, including their perhaps maybe the engineers, to help scale up and modernize manufacturing, the manufacturing business from the 1950s onwards?
I don't know the full story, no doubt, but I do know that one of the Yo brothers, in fact, there were 5 brothers who came from China eventually to Singapore, and one of them had actually studied in China. Had studied in Japan, and so there was quite close connections between Japan and at least some of the members of the Yo family. In fact, I believe that son also spoke Japanese, and that this was part of the reason that Yo was actually put in charge of the during the war of the kind of guild system for soy sauce. The Japanese set up kind of guilds. I forget what they were called, but they set up some kind of basically people to look after the various trades. And so my understanding is that a lot of that technological expertise came back from Japan in this case.
Okay, thanks, Prof. Helen. The next question we have is from Adele Lau, and she was wondering if any of the speakers today could briefly share about soy sauce production in Korea, if that was possible. So maybe perhaps Dr. Nakayama could share a bit.
Well, we actually had a collaborator who focused on South Korea for us. Her name was Kyung Jing Bae, and she was our postdoc at the Institute several years ago. But it's a little difficult, partly because, as you can probably tell, none of us here actually speak Korean. And so in terms of Korean soy sauce production, in the Chosun dynasty, there was much more home-based female labor, domestic consumption, basically production for domestic consumption. In 1902, the Japanese first soy sauce factory was made in Incheon. So even before Japan's sort of takeover of the peninsula, and the Japanese expansion of soy sauce was obviously furthered with the annexation of the Korean peninsula. And after the Japanese surrendered and were defeated in World War II, the Koreans regained their market and I think used a certain different kind of technology, but I'm not actually a specialist on this. I can't comment any further on that.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Liam Lefferts, and he was wondering what the difference is between wooden barrels and ceramic barrels, and also what the difference would be between placing these barrels in the open versus placing them in a building. Perhaps either Dr. Wong or Mr. Chan could share their thoughts on this.
Okay, I can explain a little bit. For the wooden barrels that you've seen in our slides, those are for packaging. Imagine that is a contemporary glass bottle. Back then glass bottles is very expensive. So these are or tin cans or plastic barrels. These days when we shipped it to, let's say, a restaurant or a hotel, we use a plastic pail, like 50 50 kg or more, so several liters of soy sauce for catering services. These are the the predecessors of these plastic pails. We use wooden barrels. And in terms of fermentation, in our factory, we transit from the clay pots to these kind of concrete. You can see a pool where it's rectangular, is no longer circular in shape. So when you're asking what's the difference between a wooden barrel, chromatic or cement barrels, this wooden barrel is specific for export.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chan. So our next question is from Li Xunxiang. So he's Mr. Lee is asking, Miss Lee, sorry, I'm not sure, but he's asking what's the difference between 酱油 and 酱油膏, which is soy sauce paste, which is popular in Taiwan, and why didn't 酱油膏 spread to other parts of East Asia? This question is directed to Prof. Leong, so perhaps Prof. Leong could share.
I think I haven't done any study on 酱油膏, but I think some Taiwanese soy sauce makers use glutinous rice to thicken the soy sauce. So this may be the method they use to make a thicker, texturally more dense kind of soy sauce. I think this type of soy sauce products are popular in Taiwan, in Fujian, and in overseas Fujian communities. Not so much in Guangdong and not so much in northern China.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Leong. The next question we have is from Derek Wee, and Derek is wondering, is the heritage-centric branding of Asian soy sauce producers gaining an increasing amount of prominence or popularity in Western markets today? So this question is directed to all our panel members. Perhaps Dr. Wong could, yeah.
Sure. If I can jump in here, I think it's important for us to remember that what we're discovering in various places in terms of heritage, when is marketed to a different location, the applications can be quite different, as Daniel has shown in his slides of the export-oriented business that his company is doing, and and sometimes the surprising applications of sauces in ways that we won't find as natural in the home market. But even then, I think if we were to reflect on our home consumption of soy sauces, we can also see trends developing as well. It is important for us to note that there are times when our practices are changing from, say, dipping to more using it for cooking, and the mixture of other ingredients in the soy sauce as we consume it. I'm not sure how you do in Singapore. I guess the dipping that I am more accustomed to is when I have Hainanese chicken rice, and then there's a dipping dish of soy sauce. In Hong Kong, we don't dip much anymore, unless we are having sushi. But then in Japan, you have a lot more dipping practices. And that in and of itself is also changing our interaction with the sauce itself. Because if you add other ingredients to it, our eating habits and our interaction, our experience with that soy sauce is completely different. And that's something that we can hardly control when you get into the foreign markets. And what we consider heritage, they will build on it in ways that we'll find quite astonishing.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. So the next question we have is for Prof. Hallam. It's from Carrie Medwick. So Prof. Hallam, did you find any other Singapore products that followed the same type of revival as the soy sauce companies that you've presented?
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I mean, I do think this is part of a kind of broader kind of opening up of this idea of food as heritage, right? I mean, we see this, obviously we're here today as part of this National Heritage Board event because food is considered a significant part of Singapore's history, right? And this is becoming this idea of food as tradition, food as culture. This is something that's becoming more and more prevalent in Singapore in particular, and it's being kind of promoted as such by the government, but also by individual manufacturers, right, like the soy sauce businesses. But it's certainly, I mean, Singapore, it's not an agricultural country, right? So it doesn't have kind of, many countries this happens, this kind of revival happens in the agricultural space, like heritage black beans in Taiwan, or whatever, heritage pigs in Italy or Spain, right? So Singapore doesn't have that, but something like soy sauce, the revival of this traditional industry is a way in which one can see this kind of thing occurring, right? And, I think this ties in a little bit to the last question as well, in some sense, right? That, in fact, this is part of a kind of broader global movement around, this kind of realization of the kind of artisanal value of foods, right? And so I think my sense is that for soy sauce, it hasn't quite caught on in the West yet, right? That, for most people outside of East Asia, the kikoman on the table at the Chinese restaurant, or the kikoman, that you pour, on your sushi or whatever, right? That's soy sauce, right? And this idea of something else as an artisanal product hasn't quite reached soy sauce yet, but it's coming, I think, right? Because this is such a big trend, from everything from kind of beer to cheese to pigs, as I said, right? This is part of a kind of broader movement.
Thanks, Prof. So the next question we have is from Adele Lau again. So her question is, how did all of the speakers we have here today actually stumble upon soy sauce as their research subjects? So we get all the panelists to share, so perhaps we could start with Dr. Nakayama.
Well, I think one of the uniting factors was that Professor Leung, saw soy sauce as something that was ubiquitous. That is to say, it existed in many societies in many different forms. So whether it was fish sauce or soy sauce, and that was one way to think about making modernity in East Asia, which is part of our collaborative research project. And for me, it was interesting as well because I grew up in Tokyo, but my mother is from the South, and so I'm used to a much sweeter soy sauce. And I think that many people in Japan also don't know the historical origins of the diversity of soy sauces that you can find throughout the Japanese islands. And so historically speaking, soy sauce wasn't necessarily a daily consumable for everybody. And as I think some of the issues were raised earlier, as the diet changed, there needed to be new recipes that were created. So when in the late 19th century, the government was trying to have the Japanese eat more meat, they tried to create dishes that use soy sauce and create recipes so that people would consume more based on soy sauce. And I think right now, one of the things you see is that because of this health concerns, but also perhaps a carbohydrate very focused diet is not necessarily popular with the younger population, soy sauce consumption and its related condiments are actually declining in its importance in the Japanese cuisine. And so the government is trying to resurrect a certain kind of soy sauce culture as well. And so for me, it was really interesting to think not just about the technology, the chemistry, or the science, but also what we can see about the cultural trends and the political and social ideologies that accompany it. So,
thank you, Dr. Nakayama. Perhaps the rest of the speakers could chime in any order.
Okay, I can say something. The reason for my interest in working on soy sauce is completely accidental. I was doing a research project on nutrition and food in modern China, and as I went through archives, historical documents, and so on and so forth, I just discovered that there was a tremendous amount of documents on soy sauce making in modern China from the late Qing to the Republican period. And I was particularly intrigued by the involvement of the Republican state or even the late Qing state in trying to industrialize soy sauce, trying to modernize soy sauce making, both as an economic strategy to improve China's economy, and just have some knowledge of the process. And so a whole generation of food experts on fermentation appeared in the late Qing period when schools began to teach fermentation technique, and laboratories were making experiments to find out what is the best way of making soy sauce. It also has become a nationalistic enterprise. You want China to become strong, then make some good soy sauce. So I found this extremely interesting. So I went into it and looked at other aspects of soy sauce, and I found it more and more intriguing. It's a very rich topic that very few people have really worked on because it has become an everyday mundane food, and you have it on your table every day. You don't even think about it. But then when you look at the history, it tells you a lot about political changes, social changes, cultural changes in China and in every country in East Asia. So that's why I got into it, and I'm trying to do something about it. And I don't think I have exhausted everything yet, but I think I know by now. I know much more than I did when I began to look at this this condiment.
Dr.
If
Wong,
I can
perhaps?
chime in, my curiosity about soy sauce actually started at a location that's close to you in Singapore than here in Hong Kong. I was in Vietnam, and they were trying to explain to me how different their cuisine was supposed to be. And somehow they focus on this dish, Chinese watercress or water morning glory, tong xin chai. And so that's something I eat in Hong Kong as well. So I'm not sure if that's so unique to your location. And then they decided to tell me, well, maybe it's different because of the sauce we use. We use our fish sauce. We use our nut mom. And okay, that's different. And supposedly you guys use your soy sauce. I said, well, not quite. We actually use fermented tofu for cooking that. So somehow this whole idea of what you put in your cooking defines who you are, but then actually not quite, because there's a lot of overlap in it as well. And as you look across fish sauce, soy sauce, fermented tofu, many of these particular condiments that we take for granted at our own locations, but somehow become special to people who are not familiar with them, they are basically fermented protein products that would produce a strong flavor. So I guess being a foodie myself and thinking that this is quite an intellectual question that I was confronted with at a different location, I decided, well, maybe I'll start with something that I'm supposedly more familiar with, soy sauce. And coming back to Hong Kong, it was also quite a shock, because I didn't know of Daniel's family's product when I was in America. And well, at least not as a Hong Kong product. And I kept looking at that bottle thinking that was probably made somewhere in the US. And I didn't quite recognize it as something from home until I came home and I realized the long history of Gunzan making that sauce product and the export in such high volume to the US market. Then I rediscovered my home taste. So this whole business of taste is quite intriguing. And so I'm digging deeper and learning more every day.
Thank you. Prof. Helen?
Yeah, I mean, I think these answers just suggest, we spoke about tradition and modernity at the start, but I also think this kind of idea of what binds parts of Asia together and what also perhaps separates different cultures, right, around this idea of what do you put on your food and what condiments do you use, right? I think this is one of the things that we're all interested in and one of the things we found out. For me, the answer to this, in some sense, the question about what drew me to this topic was partly very simple. I actually found in the National Archives here there are in fact several oral histories with some of the Year brothers, and in fact one of them is a 216-page interview. So this is a kind of irresistible kind of document for a historian. So I was kind of like, I have to do something with this.
Thank you for your sharings. So the next question we have is a pretty fun one. So it's from Ping Chu and it's directed to any of our panelists today. And the question is, which country has the saltier soy sauce? Anyone can go
I
ahead.
cannot give you a definite answer.
I have no idea.
But it's definitely not Japanese. and I think the Fujian and the Taiwanese are pretty salty, as I explained, because they don't use flour to ferment. So there's very little carbohydrate in the fermentation product, so it doesn't break down into sugar. So it's just protein, a lot of amino acids, and salt, a lot of salt. So I think it goes with I think that in a sense, Taiwanese food is slightly on the salty side, but I am not sure that it's the most salty. And I think that soy sauce made in North China in the Republican period is also known to be quite salty. And the soy sauce made in the Yangtze River around Shanghai is supposed to be not as salty, much more complex because the weather, the climate is more climate. So there are different explanations why some sauces are saltier and some sauces are sweeter. I think the climate and the environment is one explanation, and then the kind of food that you want to eat with soy sauce is another explanation.
I cannot give you the ecological answer that Angela just gave, but I can give, I don't have the empirical evidence, but I can offer a conjecture based on business. The smartest companies will sell the least salty soy sauce, because if it's salty, your consumers can consume less of it and you'll sell less of it. So if you want to sell more, you cannot make it so salty.
Perhaps Mr. Chan could share a bit of his thoughts on this.
Okay, so when you're talking about soy sauce being more sweet and salty, there's actually, if you really want to know how salty that is, you should look at the nutritional table instead of by your taste of your tongue, because a lot of companies, when they are making soy sauce in especially those contemporary mass market, mass product soy sauce that you can easily access in the supermarket, is that they add additional sugar in it. So in the fermentation process, we add around the same amount of salt in order for it to ferment, whether it is Japanese or Taiwanese or Hong Kong or Singaporean. However, after fermentation process, when we are cooking the soy sauce to kill off the bacteria and do the filterings, some of the companies, they will add sugar for a more contemporary taste, because when you have sugar added in it, when you are putting into your mouth, your tongue will say, oh, this is sweet. Your tongue will receive less salty signal on it. So you will feel this is more easily put into your mouth because it's sweet in a sense, because that's sugar. However, the sodium content is still the same. It's just you cannot feel it. So if you are very concerned about your health, and if you have some health issues that your doctor said don't consume a lot of salty things, you should not be judging the food based on your taste, because your tongue will most likely trick you if they have added additional sugar in it. And also, there's a new market for these kind of reduced sodium soy sauce. The thing is that, and this is especially the case in the Cantonese market, in the Cantonese soy sauce, is that when you're doing a reduced sodium, actually that company is still using the same amount of sodium to do it, but then or maybe a little bit less. But then, if you are reducing the salt content, how are you doing the fermentation? Without salt, you're not doing fermentation. So what are they going to add is that they will add artificial chemicals. There are plenty of artificial chemicals. Like you can tell by that English word that you cannot even pronounce. Those things, if you're looking at it, you'll find it a lot. That some of them can be artificial flavor, can be artificial preservatives. So these kind of things are actually things that you should be aware of, because it is a more less sodium, less salty soy sauce, but in another sense that is actually not quite healthy for your diet. So for my advice to you is that if you are very concerned about saltiness of the soy sauce, get less of it. Don't pour a whole bottle of soy sauce into your dish. Just taste it a little spoonful by little spoonful, a teaspoon, half a teaspoon. Don't put like 10 tablespoons of things into your dish. That's my recommendation.
Well, those were some really insightful recommendations. Thank you for everybody who shared so far, and thank you to all our audience members for posing all your questions. But we only have time for one more question, and this last question comes from Christina Fong. And the question is, if there is a nose for perfumes or a sommelier for wines, is there such a profession or an expertise for soy sauce? So is there an equivalent for soy sauce?
I think
These
our
questions should be answered by Izumi.
So the answer would be yes. At least in the case of Japan, we have a soy sauce sommelier who Angela and I had the pleasure of meeting. And there is a Japanese book that she wrote with another soy sauce sommelier, where she goes through the country and basically has gone to most production sites and described the taste of soy sauce. And this book has been translated into Chinese in a Taiwanese press. And so for those of you who are interested, I'm sure you can find it. But I do think it's an interesting concept because one of the questions that Angela and I asked when we went to interview soy sauce makers in Shodoshima, which is an island off the coast of Shikoku, which was historically a major production site of soy sauce. We asked it, how do you determine good soy sauce? Is it the taste? And almost all of them invariably said it's actually the smell. It's the smell of soy sauce that tells you, and that they could actually discern the difference between the different producers of soy sauce in that particular island based on smell and taste. The smell seemed to be playing a much larger role than I've ever imagined in the identification of quality of soy sauce.
Thank you, Dr. Nakayama. So we've now come to the end of this evening's session. My sincere apologies if we didn't have enough time to answer some of your questions, but thank you once again to all our panelist members, the National Heritage Board for putting together this evening's event, and the audience members for tuning in and posing your questions. So the Singapore Heritage Fest this year runs from the 3rd of May to the 30th of May. You can follow us on our Facebook page or visit our website at sgheritagefest.gov.sg to explore more stories of our history. So with that, we would like to thank everybody for participating in this evening's event. Have a pleasant evening and good night. Thank you.